Must have been third grade. I was looking out the chain link fence looking for my mom after school one day. 3 o'clock, 3:15, she still didn't show up. 3:30, just about all the other kids had been picked up by their families or friends. Finally, about 3:40, I saw my mom's gold Jeep Cherokee coming in to pick me up. My mom was late. My mom was late a lot because my mom was working. She worked all the time. In fact, my mom was known as the sandwich lady around town. She made sandwiches and delivered them around town. She was also a caterer. When she wasn't working, she was prepping, but prepping was also work. You see, we had a commercial kitchen in our house. We converted the garage. And so in my life, when I was growing up, she was just constantly working. Maybe some of you can relate to this. My family is full of nurses, custodians, carpenters. My family is full of ranchers and farmers, people that really privilege their jobs over many other aspects of their lives. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it becomes a very large part of their lives, as it does for many of us. Maybe some of you have flown recently, or maybe not, with the pandemic. But perhaps you remember the first thing you might have talked to someone about sitting next to you was, what do you do for a living? What is it that you do? That question, seemingly innocuous, communicates so much. There's evaluation, there's judgment. Even though we don't like to admit it, it says a lot about a person, or at least what we interpret as that person's identity. You know, growing up, I understood the importance of work, as do many folks around here. The American work ethic is ingrained upon our American mythos. Our economy is built on it. Now, I'm not here to debunk capitalism and to say don't work another day in your life. No. But instead, let's think about some of those seemingly innocuous questions we tend to ask folks. What do you do for a living? Or, to our children, what do you want to be when you grow up? It seems like a great question. Tells us so much about them. But let's take a step back and let's try to buck that system and look at some of the consequences that those types of questions may have upon people. I remember growing up, I didn't really know what I wanted to do for a living. I loved movies, I loved Office Space, and so I watched Office Space all the time, and I decided I want to be like the Bobs in Office Space. For those of you that haven't seen the Mike Judge film Office Space, the Bobs were consultants, and this idea of consultant had a really nice ring to it. Now, they were efficiency and productivity consultants. I didn't really want to go in that area, but I knew I wanted to kind of just study work and think about work, and that's why I'm a professor of organizational communication. And it lets me really debunk some of the taken-for-granted truths that we have about our work lives. So, what are those taken-for-granted truths, and where do they come from? Well, I like to call these taken-for-granted truths as kind of like a cultural totem. What do I mean by cultural totem? Well, bear with me here. Maybe you've seen the movie Inception. Leonardo DiCaprio's character, he has a top that he spins. And if that top keeps spinning, he knows that he's in a dream. He's not in reality. But if the top falls over, he knows that he is in reality. He is in the present. Well, we have these things too. In academic speak, we call these things discourses. But I like to think of them as those cultural totems, those types of symbolic formations that ground us into what we should or should not do. So, for example, walking around a farmer's market just 2 years ago, this is a true story, I looked up at a middle school marquee. This middle school marquee said, "Future college graduating class of 2028. And again, at first, this seems like it's an innocuous statement setting folks up for success, but then you start to really challenge those ideas. What are they really promoting here? What if someone doesn't want to go to college? Is college the only way to be successful? Now, I want folks to go to college. I'm a professor. We want enrollment, of course. But we need to think about everyone's individual journey and about how those cultural totems may sometimes pull us, maybe kind of makes us gravitate towards what we should or what we ought to do. Think about the pressure that you may have felt It may have been a long time for some of you, and perhaps for others, maybe not so long ago, or maybe in the present, the pressure you might have felt in high school about what to do next. That pressure, how heavy it is on someone's shoulders. What are you going to do after high school? Oh, I got to get a good SAT score, good ACT score, got to get into a good college, got to get a good job. Where does that come from? It comes from those cultural totems that we've been taught, that we see on marquees around town, that we hear from a very early age. Suicide is the number 3 leading cause of death amongst adolescents, aged 15 to 24, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The 3rd leading cause of death between 15 and 24-year-olds. Think about that. It's a leading cause of death among college students as well. Now, why is that? Well, we might point to social media. We might point to bullying. We might look to the home life balance, our family dynamic. We might also look to mental health. All these things, yes, I think that contributes, absolutely. But again, there is that pressure and that discourse, that cultural totem that tells us what it means to be successful, the ways in which we stigmatize jobs that we think are lesser than, or how we privilege jobs that are better than others. Let's buck that system. I have a way to do it, and I want you to participate. I want you to think about the ways that language controls us. Language, communication, can be very affirming, can be very powerful, can be very helpful, and it can persuade us to do things that we may or may not want to do, right? So if communication is the umbrella, let's get practical. Here's 2 things that you can do. Number 1, be curious. I give you permission to be curious, and you should give yourself permission to be curious. What does that look like? Well, instead of asking someone what they're doing with their lives on the airplane, instead of asking them what they do for a living, think of a more creative question to ask. I am a professor of communication. I study workplace wellness, and I look at communication theory, and I love talking about that, but guess what? I love skiing powder, and I loved my year at Alta, Utah, being a skier there in the knee-deep powder. I love playing Rocket League, this game on the computer where I fly cars and try and get good at playing soccer with cars. I love talking about that kind of stuff. I love talking about research too, but there is so much more to a person than their job. Now, I can kind of hear it already, right? So, Eric, this seems like a very privileged perspective. A lot of us need to work. We have to work. We don't have the privilege to do what we want. And I'm not necessarily saying that. I'm not saying to do what you love and you'll never work another day in your life. I'm not necessarily going down that route. I know that rent was due 10 days ago. Rent prices are high. We have to pay the bills. Yes, work is important. I'm not trying to buck that. But I'm trying to buck the privilege that people have in saying that I want my son or daughter, I want my friends to have a better life than I did, so I pressure them into doing things that they should or ought to do, governed by that cultural totem. Being curious means you ask more interesting questions. Being curious means that you, instead of asking, what do you want to be when you grow up? You ask a question like, what kind of a person do you want to be? Other folks are writing about this as well. It's not new to me, but it's not necessarily catching on yet. I want this to catch on. Let's ask more interesting questions. Let's be more curious. The other day, my son, this is a true story, he asked me, Daddy, are we going to be made extinct by a meteorite just like the dinosaurs were? He really said this. He's 4 years old, very articulate. And I said, no, I don't think so, but I'm from liberal arts, so I don't really know much about astrophysics. But you know what? We can go to the library, and we can find a book. And we did that. Further, we went to the museum. We saw an exhibit about space where we could interact with it together and learn about it together. That's his interest. Maybe you have a kiddo or a friend and they play video games like me, maybe you can ask a question about that to take an interest in what they enjoy doing. We talk about our likes online all the time, right? You click a button, but ask someone what they enjoy doing. Number 2, what can you do? Stop saying that free time is a bad word. In the American mythos, again, it seems like everyone's afraid to talk about how we have free time. Or we don't admit that we have free time. We want to talk about how busy we are and how much we work. And again, that's ingrained upon our cultural discourse. I'm not necessarily saying to buck that work is important, but I think that free time might help us with our mental health. It might be important for us to sometimes sit down and play a video game. It might be important for us to sometimes go for a walk after lunch. I remember interviewing for a consulting job once, and the interviewer asked me, "Oh, so what'd you do yesterday?" Just the chit-chat right before the interview started. And I said, "Well, yesterday was Tuesday. I went for a nice hike in the mountains. It was glorious. It was wonderful. I really enjoyed it." And she looked at me bug-eyed, and she said, "On a Tuesday?" And right then and there, I knew this job probably wasn't going to work out, because what I interpreted from her was that Monday through Friday, that belonged to the organization. That belonged to corporate. So I didn't get that job, went a different route, happy to be here. But whose time is it? Isn't time a universal right? Shouldn't you have time to do what you want? Yes, we have to work, but just challenge yourself. If time was universal, couldn't you advocate for even other cultures who privilege jobs over their parts of identity to know that, yes, your time is yours. It's not necessarily the organization's. Your identity is so much more. So those 2 things again, be curious and admit you have free time and take responsibility for it. Do something that makes you happy to help us with our mental health. Be who you are, not what you do. Thank you.